Captain Tachyon, Croyd, Crenson, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. So I had this thought, as has been discussed in the other videos, and as anyone can see when they go on a Wildcards website, whether it's Wikipedia, the Wikipedia entry of Wildcards, or just the official site or whatever, they sort of have taken the saga, which is, at 30-some books at this point, and 31 books, I guess, as of July 11th, and they subdivide them into what they call these triads, in some cases a quartet, and there are some outliers that maybe don't fit in those triads or whatever, but there's a generally speaking, over most of the history of the series, they've divided it into these triads. And there's the original triad, which they sometimes talk about as the astronomer triad, since he's the big villain. They sort of subdivide a lot of them by the antagonists. So the first three involve the astronomer / the Masonic cult. And then the second group of books is referred to as the Puppet Man Quartet, because Puppet Man is the big bad over the course of those four. But then there are these sort of things that, in doing it that way, certain elements of the series and certain antagonistic forces of the series are sort of ignored. For example, you take someone like the character Kien, who's the antagonist for John Joseph Miller's character Yeoman. If not actually appearing in every Yeoman story, he's certainly an element of every Yeoman story, informing every Yeoman story, because that's the big point of all the Yeoman stories, is to finally get revenge on Kien, who is a crime lord who oversees this group called the Shadow Fists, or in some cases they are referred to as the Shadow Fist Society. But there's no triad named after the Shadow. There's no Shadow Fist triad. Partly that's because that saga starts in the first book, and then the final sort of showdown with Kien is in volume 9, much later. But at the same time, there's the gang war storyline where the Shadow Fist Society wages kind of war in the streets against the mafia. That begins in volume 3, and then there's mention of it kind of in the background of volume 4, and the new version of volume 4 has some explicit stuff with the Shadow Fists, thanks to a newly interpolated story by Kevin Andrew Murphy. And then volume 5 is really the big climax to the crime war, where one side beats the other, and that's kind of the end. So you could argue, 3, 4, and 5 are the gang war triad. There's all these interesting sort of subdivisions within the divisions, or Venn diagrams that one could create. But then 8, 9, 10, and 11 are the Rocks triad, or, well, there's 4 of them. So the Rocks Quartet, that's the one that they name after either the Jumpers. It's either the Jumper Saga or the Saga of Bloat and the Rocks, because both those factions are prominent and preeminent over the course of those 4 books. And then it's the Card Sharks triad, and once again the Card Sharks are the villains. But it got me thinking, all these triads named after the antagonists, is there some unity among the protagonists? Like if you look at a section of the books, so take the original triad, for example, or the one where they fight the astronomer. Is it the same protags over all 3 books? How many of them are consistent through all 3 books? And I found myself sort of just kind of cogitating on that for whatever reason. So, for example, you could look at the first book and say, okay, so you've got Golden Boy, the Sleeper, Tachyon, Turtle, Fortunato, Vagabond, Sewer Jack, Yeoman, Captain Trips, although he's not called Captain Trips yet, he's just referred to as Mark Meadows at that point. Thanks to the newly interpolated stories, you've got a few other ones that, in 2 cases, in the case of David D. Levine and Michael Cassatt's stories, they're inserts with characters that seem like they're probably just one-off characters for that book. Whereas Carrie Vaughn takes a protagonist that we don't see until later, Jennifer Malloy, sort of retroactively inserts her earlier into the continuity. And then when you get to the second book, quite a few of those characters do carry over. Tachyon again. So the ones that carry over from book 1, Tachyon, or it's probably easier to say the ones who don't, because Golden Boy does not. He shows up sort of for a cameo, but he's a big part of a story in book 1, but then he's not in book 2 at all. Wraith is not there. But the characters that do, and Vagabond and Sewer Jack, who are in volume 1, do not come back for volume 2. But a lot of the other ones do. The Sleeper, Tachyon, Turtle, Yeoman, Fortunato, and Mark Meadows all all come back. So you think, okay, there's some consistency with the protagonists in these triads. But then the third one is kind of an interesting beast, because Fortunato still is there, and then Wraith is a lead character in that. But it's the Wraith thread in that book is really the continuation of the Yeoman thread, of the thread with Daniel Brennan, aka Yeoman. It's just that by making Wraith the POV character, we get to see Yeoman through the eyes of someone else. But it really is the continuation of the Yeoman Kian saga that I mentioned earlier. Similar thing with what Melinda Snodgrass does. She writes from the point of view of a new character called Roulette, but her whole story is wrapped up with Tachyon, and almost every scene with Roulette, basically she meets Tachyon and then she sort of is with Tachyon the whole day. So it's really Melinda Snodgrass's way of continuing the Tachyon thread, but seeing Tachyon through the eyes of a different character. Arguably, depending on how you look at it, you could say, okay, so Fortunato is there for all three, Yeoman is there for all three, Wraith, thanks to Carrie Vaughan's new interpolation, Wraith is there for book 1 and book 3. Tachyon is there for all three, Wraith is there for 1 and 3. Book 3 brings back Bagamon and Sewer Jack, so they're there for both the first and the third. Walton Simon's character Demise, who's introduced in volume 2 as a lead, and then also gets to be a lead in volume 3. So there's quite a bit of continuity there overall. But George R.R. Martin, the impresario of it all, after 2 books of making the turtle his POV character, his avatar, he switches to Hiram Worcester, the proprietor and founder of the restaurant Aces High. So a real departure, because suddenly there's this character who's now a lead in volume 3 who was barely a presence in the first 2 books. So interesting to think about that Martin, who's in charge of it all, he was the one to sort of break in a way with sort of the sort of Aristotelian unity of saying, okay, let's keep the same protagonists through all 3 books of this putative trilogy. Martin was willing to say, actually, why don't we don't need to be chained to that idea. It's a new book, so there can be new protagonists. And it's not just the question of who are the leads in volume 3, but which leads from the first 2 books are suddenly dropped in volume 3. It's interesting when you're reading the books for the first time, or trying to recreate the sense of reading them for the first time, of like just kind of going in cold, forgetting what you know. You get to volume 3 and go, oh, well, what happened to the turtle? Now he's just sort of a sidelined character. The Sleeper is another character who just is completely sidelined after being so important in the first 2 books. Golden Boy was important in volume 1, but now he's gone. Modular Man was important in volume 2, but he barely has a presence in volume 3. Mark Meadows, after being very important in volumes 1 and 2, just has another just kind of non-effectual cameo in volume 3. So that inaugural triad does kind of set a template where when it comes to protagonists, it's kind of like, well, anything goes, you know. Then you get to the second group, and there's even more, I think, discontinuity in terms of what characters we're following and what characters are our POV characters. And it's become the nature of the Wildcards saga that just every book you're going to see some familiar characters as leads, some characters that you've already seen in those lead roles, or you'll see characters who you recognize because they were supporting characters, and now they've been kind of quote-unquote promoted to lead. But then you'll also see lead characters who you thought were mainstays of the series, be written out. Someone like Fortunato, who's so hugely important to that original triad, he shows up in volume 4 for one last time, and then is essentially written out, at least as a lead. And after that, the appearances of Fortunato become very sparing. Eventually that will occur with Tachyon too, as has been talked about in some of the earlier videos. Tachyon is a sort of mainstay of the series all through the first 10 books, and at the end of that 10th book he's written out, and we haven't seen him since, or have barely seen him since in later books, and now it's up to 33 volumes. So there have been more books that didn't focus on Tachyon than that did. Yeah, just a feature of this particular saga. I mean, obviously sagas that run this long, you're going to get, I imagine, both, some sagas where it's like something like Star Wars, we're always going to be following a Skywalker of some generation, versus other sagas like I guess Star Trek comes to mind, where you might think at one point the saga of Star Trek is the saga of Kirk and Spock and that crew, and then at a certain point they departed from that. And so I guess any saga, whether it's on television or film or literary sagas, will have their own set of rules that they play by. But so the Puppet Man Quartet, for example, you really get a sense of how, even though it's this quartet of novels that are bound together by a common villain over the course of all 4 books, you have this sort of surprising scenario where the common villain does not mean that there's also necessarily a common hero. So in the first volume, you get this range of protagonists that, again, some of them are familiar, like the aforementioned Tachyon and Fortunato. Golden Boy comes back, sort of shares the lead with Tachyon in the Melinda Snodgrass story. But then a lot of characters who are again, supporting characters promoted, such as Xavier Desmond, written by George R.R. Martin, or Chrysalis, written by John Joseph Miller, formerly, a supporting character from the Yeoman saga, and now kind of promoted to a lead. Peregrine, kind of the same thing. Peregrine is a familiar presence, but never did we see something from her point of view until Volume 4. Same with Cordelia, who was introduced in Volume 3 but didn't get much of a voice. Or some brand new characters, such as the Leanne C. Harper's hero twins, who are new as of Volume 4. And again, there are the interpolated stories, like Kevin Andrew Murphy promoting Troll to a lead role after him having been a supporting character up to that point. Same with Lady Black in the other interpolated story by Carrie Vaughn. Yeah, so that mix of unfamiliar protagonists, familiar protagonists. But then when you move to Volume 5, you get a surprisingly small amount of overlap with the leads that you saw in Volume 4. I think, is Tachyon maybe the only one? Tachyon is a lead in 4 and 5. I'm not sure that any other character... Well, even Puppet Man himself, because Puppet Man as the villain of this quartet is given the spotlight for the first time since his first appearance in Volume 1. He's a character who showed up in Volume 1, I guess, as a protagonist, but he's the overall villain of he's a villain in that universe, although he is a protagonist, I guess, technically, because we do see things from his point of view. Everyone's the hero of their own story, I guess. But yeah, so like Puppet Man is an example of a character who shows up, and it seems like a real villainous, malevolent premise in Volume 1. And indeed he is, but not so powerful that he isn't sort of completely sidelined in Volume 2 and Volume 3. But then Volume 4 he comes back into prominence. That said, though, his role in Volume 5 is pretty small. He's the villain of one story, but he's not, as I recall, he's not a POV character in Volume 5. He's Stephen Lee writes from the point of view of some other characters, one of whom you could argue is a carryover from Volume 4. The character of Misha, who is we do see some stuff written from her point of view, from what I recall, in Volume 4, and then she also has a significant story in Volume 5, both written by Stephen Lee. So Misha, or the Kahina, the seer. So she's another character who carries over. Obviously, there are many more characters that feature in both books, but I'm talking just in terms of whose POV are we actually seeing, which characters are actually like lead characters from one book to the next. And from Volume 4 to Volume 5, there are very few that are leads in both. I think Tachyon is really the most prominent. But then you have other characters like the Sleeper, who, as I mentioned, is kind of sidelined for the climax of the Astronomer triad, the original triad. Sleeper comes back to play a very important part in Volume 5. Just as for example, same with Modular Man, who's very important in Volume 2 and then not seen after that. So yeah, I mean, if you were to chart these different characters and graph when they appear and when they don't, obviously it would become a very kind of beautiful and complicated visual pattern. But so yeah, over the course of the saga, characters recur, they go away, they come back. But I guess I just thought it was interesting to note the way that you would think that over the course of one trilogy or one tetrad or whatever, like one narrative unit, that at least during those books you'd have some familiar favorites through all three, and you don't all the time, like there's very few characters who can be said to be important in all three books or every single installment of a triad, even if they're, you know, prominent throughout most of it. Because then when you move on through the Puppet Man Quartet, Volume 6, it's Golden Boy and Tachyon and Puppet Man again, so that all makes sense. But, you know, suddenly Demise is back. Like I mentioned, Demise being significant in Volumes 2 and 3, but he's not in Volume 4 at all, for example, and he's only got a cameo in Volume 5, but now suddenly for one of the climactic books of that sequence, because 6 and 7 are really like sort of the dual climax of that arc, and suddenly you're looking at Demise kind of pulling out into the lead and suddenly being very important again, whereas he wasn't for 4 and 5. And then Volume 7, of course, Jay Aykroyd, who's become a fan favorite character at that point, really hadn't appeared in many books, has a lot of great scenes in Volume 3, but apart from that, really minor character, really. But Martin kind of, you know, promotes him to a lead in Volume 7, and he's the one who kind of so I think I've used the image in the past of like the writers kind of passing narrative baton, you know, one writer passing the baton to the next. But in a way, you can kind of see that with the characters too. You know, even if it's the same writer, you know, like so George R.R. Martin is writing Xavier Desmond in Volume 4, the first part of the Puppet Man tetrad. Then he writes Turtle in Volume 5, doesn't contribute prose to Volume 6, but then writes Jay Aykroyd in Volume 7. So, you know, Martin himself, you know, again, the unity is created by the villains, Puppet Man and Team Elise, the two major villains over the course of 4, 5, 6, and 7. But the heroes, they kind of leapfrog over each other, and you know, so Xavier Desmond is passing the baton to the Turtle, and then over to Jay Aykroyd, if you're looking at like Martin's characters. And then Walter John Williams, his Modular Man character features very prominently in Volume 5, but then when Walter John Williams comes back for Volume 6, you might think, oh, more Modular Man, but no, instead he goes back to Golden Boy. So it's interesting how these books sort of, even for the big climax, are unashamed to just throw in a new character or throw in a new lead who hasn't been a lead before and say, all right, this is who we're following now. Okay, so this video is getting a little long, so yeah, we'll break this into 2 parts. We'll look more at the sort of pros and cons of shifting protagonists around over the course of a single triad in next week's video. So, till then.
So my honey and me go to a counselor to try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing, but before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.